morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining me from. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to be with me during this 1 hour. My name is Hanna. I am the chief architect of Romana software. I have worked with Romana ALM from the very beginning. Some of you might know me from the International Institute for Software Testing. I am also the CEO of IIST. Today, I'm going to spend the next hour or so sharing with you what I believe to be a most effective way to work with user stories. We'll learn about acceptance criteria, we'll learn about scenarios, we'll learn about the difference, and we will be able to decide whether we should be using just acceptance criteria or scenario, or even both of them together. This depending on what you would like to achieve from your project. All right, we'll start right away. This webinar is hosted by Romana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management, and I'm pleased to be with you today. Let's go ahead here. So maybe before I start, I should just ask a question. How many of you have actually worked with agile projects and user stories? Go ahead and raise your hand if you did, anytime in the past or now. I just want to see how many people I need to address if they did not see user stories before. So how many of you actually have seen and worked with user stories? Go ahead and raise your hand. I hope you're all hearing me fine. I can see few people raising their hands. Does this mean that those who are not have not actually worked with user story? Because that makes a difference in the way I will conduct my webinar. I still have quite a bit of people who have not seen user stories or have not worked with user stories. That's about more than 50% of the attendees today. Again, I will repeat the question quick. If you have used user stories in any project, please go ahead and raise your hand. Now I get more people. And don't put your down yet, because I continue to count. Okay, I still have a reasonable number of people who have not used user stories. Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense. Only few people have not used user stories before. Of course, I needed to make sure, because otherwise, if you have not seen them, if you have not used them, I'll have to explain more. All right. So since most of you have used user stories, here are what user stories. Simple statement describing what a user of a system can do or will do or would like to do. Okay, very simple. With that being said, we know that every user story must be about something that a user is interested in or interested in doing. That's why, as we're going to see, the format of a user story, it says as a role, a user role in the system, I want to be able to do whatever. Okay. Well, they claim that it's written in a language that users can understand. Of course, it's a very simple. It's a much more brief than a requirement. We cannot put too much details in user story, and there are even some practice rules against putting more details in the user story. And of course, like requirements, user stories only focus on what I'd like to do with the system, not how I want to do it with the system. Okay, simple enough. Simple enough. Here is the format. You all have seen this before. an example here. As a customer, I want to be able to check the status of my order online. And the last part of the user story, which is sometimes we refer to it as the cause, or the objective, or the purpose, or whatever you want to call it. Some people put it there because they say that it adds some context to the user story. Last week, I gave, not last week, 2 weeks ago, I gave another webinar on managing user stories, and I discussed in details the last clause of a user story. But keep in mind that sometimes this last clause that we think that will add some context, sometimes it doesn't, because you can be writing user story, and that's my experience. At least I write user stories, and I look at what kind of clause I will put at the end of the user story that can add some context to the user story or give me an idea about what the user story is all about, but I cannot find any clause. Okay, this one makes sense so that I know when I will receive it. Although the clause is there, I'm not sure if this adds any context to the user story. If my user story was something else, like as a customer, I want to be able to change my order online, I'm not sure what I can put there as a so that. I don't know what's the reason why I want to be able to change an order. But again, we're not going to argue today about that so that clause or not. It's if you feel comfortable, if you feel you always have to put it there, that's up to you. I just want to tell you that do not try hard to come up with a so that clause, because it might be just meaningless to add. Well, now, of course, if you work with user stories, you know the concept of an epic. An epic is a large user story that can be broken down into a number of user stories. Here is an example of an epic. As a passenger, I want to be able to check into my flight online and to get my boarding pass. As you can tell, this user stories can be broken down because it has so much stuff into it. I just am giving you example of 3 other user stories there. As a passenger, I want to be able to select a seat. That's part of checking online. I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class and pay the difference. Again, that I can do this either within the check-in process or outside the check-in process, and so on. I want to get my boarding pass on a mobile device. I want to be able to get my boarding pass by email. All these are reasonable user stories that are a breakdown of the epic at the top. So far, so good. You know all that stuff, right? Now, here are a few limitations of user stories that I've seen during my practice. It's not that I'm telling you don't use user stories. Absolutely not. If you're working on an agile project that uses user story, you will continue to use user stories. But those things I put in front of you are things that you need to pay attention to when you use user stories, so that you can find another way to fill that gap and fill those limitations. Certainly, we all know that they are too brief. Most importantly, they're not suitable for stating shall not behavior, and that I'm going to discuss this more when I come to speak about acceptance criteria. Simply because when we write user stories, we always say, as a role, I want to be able to do whatever. So you can tell it right away, it's about things that I want to be able to do. It's not about things that I do not want to be able to do. It's not about things that I don't want the system to do. So, but again, one more time, this problem is not only with the user story. In fact, it has been magnified in user stories, but in my 40 plus years working with requirements and user stories, I've seen requirements written all the time not to also address shall not do's. And for the last more than 30 years now, I've been teaching people how to write requirements that address shall not do scenarios, because shall not do scenarios are the ones that really cause most of the problems in the system after the system is released. They are the kind of things we do not want the system to do, or they are the kind of things we do not want the user to be able to do. These are important. But again, because of the format of the user stories and the way we write them, obviously that problem even much bigger with user stories. But again, this problem is not only with user stories. As I said, requirements also have the same problem. All right. And of course, quality requirements are things that has to do with performance, response time, safety, security, all that stuff. It is hard to use the format of a user story to describe those things, but I have seen people changing the format of the user story to include some quality requirements. In my experience, in my practice, I always like to mix user stories with requirements. If there is something that I'd rather feel more comfortable stating it as a requirement, I keep it as a requirement. If it is something that's simple enough that I can put it in a user story or in an epic, which can be decomposed to smaller user stories, I do that. So it's not a rule that you must always use user stories in all your projects. And I'm sure you also learned this in your own experience. By the way, if I ever say anything that you disagree with, or even something that you'd like to make a comment on, use the questions tab to post your remarks or comments or questions or whatever. It's important that we share our thoughts together. I can certainly learn from your practices the same way you would learn from mine. I have not succeeded for over 40 years in business just because I'm stuck up and I'm stubborn and I don't learn from others. In fact, it's the exact opposite. I only did what I was able to do, or I was able to do what I did because I've always learned from people like yourselves. All right. So some of you in your Agile projects used acceptance criteria, and the purpose and the reason is because you want to the details of the user story. You get some discussion either in the sprint planning session or in any session you want to have. You discuss the user stories and you either build the acceptance criteria during that meeting, or the test team or the development team or the product owner takes the time to write acceptance criteria. Again, I am not going to spend any time here to tell you who is supposed to build the acceptance criteria and how and so on, because my webinar today is mostly not about acceptance criteria, but I want to spend more time discussing the difference between acceptance criteria and scenarios. All right. So as you all know, acceptance criteria is a list of items that has some benefits. Most importantly, it establishes the boundaries of the user story so that we, as a team, as an Agile team, we want to be able to tell what's in the user story and what's not, what belongs to this user story and what belongs to another user story. It's important. So in a way, you can say we're coming back now and getting those details that we were supposed to put in a requirement and put them in the acceptance criteria, because the user story does not state everything we could state in a requirement. So we use the acceptance criteria to add more details to user stories. All right. But again, yeah, most importantly, ideally, if acceptance criteria are built in a meeting, whether that meeting is in person or a virtual meeting, it stimulates the team's thinking. It helps people think more about the user story and what's all about. Okay, again, maybe I should ask another question here, but only after I bring your hands down. Hands down for everybody. How many of you actually used acceptance criteria in your agile projects? Go ahead, please, and raise your hand. One more time. I just want to make sure that how many of us know about acceptance criteria. Again, the question is, how many of you use acceptance criteria in your agile projects? Okay, please, for those of you who are not raising your hands, tell me if you use anything else beside the user stories to help you add the details of the user story. Because I'd be very concerned if you're using a user story that's as brief as we know it, and then you don't have any other mechanism by which you can get more details and establish the boundaries of the user story and achieve all these four things that are in the screen. A number of you did not raise their hands, so go ahead and share with me, please, on the questions tab. Do you use anything else different from acceptance criteria to get more details about the user story? I mean, we can learn from you. I'd like to know. I'm not aware of anything else, but let me know, please. If you use scenarios, as I'm going to explain them in a little bit, then go ahead and say scenarios. I don't want to waste your time here. You're either using acceptance criteria or you're using something else. And if you're not, then I'd like to learn how you capture the details of the user stories. Okay, we'll move on here. So here is an example of a user story. As a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. This, if you remember, this was one of the user stories that was listed in as part of the epic that I showed you. Now, if you want to think about acceptance criteria for this user story, here are some examples. And please give me your ideas if you write acceptance criteria differently from this. My understanding, my practice about acceptance criteria is that you don't follow any specific format. You simply write things that would help the test team determine whether the user story has been implemented the way it should be implemented or not. Passenger pays for the upgrade using credit card. Passenger can upgrade anytime during the check-in process. Passenger may upgrade some or all of the passengers on the same reservations. Now you can see here there is nothing that guides me to tell me what else I should list in acceptance criteria. I don't know if you encountered this before, but in my experience, working with teams, with agile teams, and looking at the work of teams at companies that I wanted to help them, I find that some people can write easily 20 and 30 acceptance criteria for a user story, and some other people wrote only 5 or 6. And that is where my problem comes, because the person who wrote only 5 or 6 acceptance criteria, whether he or she is a developer or a tester, they're not going to implement the user story the way it's supposed to be. And if no one reviews those acceptance criteria, then it would be a problem, right? So again, I will repeat, the Agile framework and the Scrum methodology did not come up with any what do I say, guidelines, measures to help the teams write the reasonable number of acceptance criteria. We are left to our own thinking. Now, the same way we talked about limitations of user story, I'm going to put those limitations of acceptance criteria again one more time. Not to tell you don't use acceptance criteria, but only to let you be aware of or make you aware of these limitations, and I want you to watch for them when you use acceptance criteria. Of course, we all know that, and please correct me if your practice is different. Acceptance criteria focus mostly on normal behavior. We take the user story as is, and we start thinking about what kind of thinking and what kind of things I need to test for. Especially, I'm going to tell you this, I found this to be 100% true, especially if acceptance criteria are written by developers and the product owners. Developers and the product owners always have a positive view to things. You know that, I know that, developers know that. Very few developers might argue and say, no, I look at things from a negative point of view. No, I have not seen this. You're not going to be a developer who is very different from the thousands of developers I dealt with in my life. We take the user story, we think about it. This is what the user wants to be able to do with the system. Let's write acceptance criteria that allows us to verify and determine that the user story have been implemented. Okay. So as a result, the really acceptance criteria are not good in describing the shall not do behavior. Shall not do behavior is very important. Again, all the kind of things that we do not want the system to allow people to do. We do not want the user to do. Of course, the user will do them. We know that. But we want to make sure that the system handles them when the user tries to do them. Okay? Like checking into the flight and getting my boarding pass. Okay? I'm assuming you will agree that I should not be able to get my boarding pass, to check into the flight and get my boarding pass if the flight has already taken off, right? It doesn't make sense. It would not be a good system, would it? So we need to test for that. So I want you to go back to your acceptance criteria or to your user story and see, does it really give you guidance to test for that? Of course, many of you, and I've heard it many times, people say, well, those are the kind of things you have to think about when you do testing. Well, we know that when it comes time to do testing, we can't think of everything to test. But again, shall not do thinking is a preparation for testing. If you can think about those negative behavior, and I'm using the negative behavior here to refer to those kind of things that we do not want the system to do. Of course, when I check into the flight, you'd agree that I should not be able to get a seat that has been assigned to someone else. Okay. Is this part of the user story? It's not. It's not written anywhere in the user story. So am I going to remember during testing to test a situation where the system is assigning a seat and something happened that the system assigned the same seat that has been already assigned to someone else? Do I have acceptance criteria to cover that? That's what I refer to as a shall not do. It's a shall not do either by the user or shall not do by the system. Okay, got that? So if anything at all you get from this discussion, I want you to develop the shall not do thinking. if you're looking at a requirement, if you're looking at a user story, if you're designing tests, if you're writing your acceptance criteria, I want you to always think about shall not do stuff and make sure they're listed somewhere, so that when it comes a time for the developer to write the code, they make sure that the code handles all those shall not do's. When it comes a time to write our test cases, we want to make sure that we have tests that cover all those shall not do's. As I said, accordingly, acceptance criteria, in my experience, do not handle abnormal, extreme, or uncommon condition. What if I put in my credit card information hoping to pay for my first class upgrade and the system crashes or I get disconnected from the internet? Is that a normal behavior? No, it's not. It's extreme, abnormal, uncommon, whatever you want to call it. Now I want you to think, do your acceptance criteria handle that? Are you going to test for that? I'm just giving you some examples of abnormal and extreme conditions that do not happen every day. Most importantly, I have not seen a way to use acceptance criteria to help me do risk-based testing. By risk-based testing, as I'm sure you know, is I want to decide what to test and what not to test. So I'm going to look at the 20 or 15 or 10 acceptance criteria that I have. And what? I say I'm going to just test the first 10 and leave the other 15. Based on what? What kind of criteria would you use to discriminate against different acceptance criteria to test them or not? That's a big deficiency, in my opinion, in acceptance criteria. Now, of course, we normally don't run into this problem because, I'm going to tell you that much, because when people write acceptance criteria, they don't write too many. They do not write too many acceptance criteria. As a result, they're able to test all of them. Again, one more time, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about risk analysis in risk-based testing using acceptance criteria. What do you do? Do you plan to test all acceptance criteria, or do you choose some of them? And if you do, which ones do you decide not to test? Now, as I have seen acceptance criteria written by many people, we do not write how do we want the system to respond to the acceptance criteria. It's like your expected results when you test. And I understand. Many people say, oh, well, no, that's going to be the expected results that I will write when I write my test cases. I say, yeah, sure. But I mean, if you're good at writing acceptance criteria, as I'm going to show you in a little bit, then some acceptance criteria do not have an obvious expected behavior that everyone can agree on. So when you take those acceptance criteria and write test cases, how are you going to write the expected results of those test cases? I mean, if we cannot agree on how the system should respond to the acceptance criteria, how am I going to write the expected results of the test case? Again, I need to hear from you about this. Do you actually put something about the expected results or expected behavior in the acceptance criteria, or you postpone them until the time you write the tests? Interestingly enough, if you postpone them until the time you write the tests, how is the developer going to write the code for that acceptance criteria? I mean, if you're not telling them what to expect when you run the tests, how do you expect them to write the code to give you the expected results you will expect? If I am your developer and you're giving me, and I have a bunch of acceptance criteria, I will just implement them, and I will implement them in a way such that the system responds to them the way I think is right. we need to agree. A big part of this whole thing is for the test team, the development team, the product owner, the business analyst, which we're all part of the agile team, of course. We all need to agree on how do we expect the system to respond to certain things. Again, all what I'm talking about will become a bit obvious when I speak about scenario. All right, so Anita is saying we put the expected results in the acceptance criteria, which is good. So you got to look for a format by which you can do that. So I guess the point I'm making, don't postpone this expected behavior until you write the test cases, because it would be too late. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about how to fill the gap through scenarios very quick. So what is a scenario? Or at least what is my definition of a scenario in my own methodology that I refer to as scenario-based development and testing. I've been teaching people and I've been helping people implement scenario-based development and testing for years. I think I should say probably easily starting the mid-90s. Because of certain experience that happened in my life, in my professional life, that led me to come up with an approach that solves a lot of the problems I encountered in one of the major projects I was part of. So anyway, scenario-based development and testing. You can listen to my recorded webinar on the Romana website on this topic. So what is a scenario? It's either a condition or a situation or an event or anything at all that can possibly happen, okay? Anything at all that can possibly happen while the system is performing the user story or the requirement. So to me, when I started actually scenario-based development and testing, not too many teams were using agile projects. I mean, mid-90s, yes, sure, agile framework was there, but not too many people were using user stories. Not too many people were using acceptance criteria. So that's why I also help people to use the scenarios with requirements. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's nothing that says scenarios are only good for user stories or only good for requirements. If they are defined, if scenarios are defined the way I'm defining them now, so they apply equally to user stories or requirements. When you think about those conditions or events or things that could happen, I want you to think about everything, whether it is normal or abnormal. And in the methodology, and that's the trick now, in the methodology, I give people guidance and I force them to think more about the abnormal, extremes, and unexpected. That's very critical here. Because if we don't think about it that early, then we will not think about them later. So if I take the same user story that I showed you earlier, as a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Just to give you an idea about how scenarios are and how you can use them to cover a lot of things. I wrote a number of scenarios here. Now, let me be clear here. There is nothing that says you cannot do the same things I am doing with scenarios with acceptance criteria. It's just a way of thinking. So maybe just to be fair to acceptance criteria, I want to go back here and say those limitations that I talked about and much more that are not here are not inherited in the acceptance criteria. They are inherited in the practices we have and the way we do acceptance criteria. So it's your practice. It's not the acceptance criteria that's the problem, forgive me to say. It's your practice that's the problem. So you need to evolve acceptance criteria to be the way you want them to be, or otherwise use scenarios. Okay, let's look at those scenarios very quick. There are too many, and I don't know if we have enough time to cover all of them. But look at the first three scenarios in front of you here. All of them are starting with what? One passenger on the reservation, upgrading to first class, while a seat available in first class. You see, what is that? What is that I wrote in the scenario? While a seat is available in the first class. Without actually giving it the name, it is what I call a precondition. Meaning that when I tested the scenario, I have to establish the precondition that a seat is available in first class. While in the second scenario, I have a different precondition. You see that? So I am thinking preconditions as I'm writing my scenarios. If you can do the same while you're writing your acceptance criteria, I have no problem. So that's part of the methodology, the scenario-based methodology, that you got to think about. You cannot just think about a scenario that could possibly happen. I want you to go and think about what preconditions must be there that would allow this scenario to happen. Look at the third one. Do I have preconditions there? Yes. The first part of the scenario is the same in all three scenarios, but the second part, the precondition, is different. There's a difference here. Now, if you look at number 4, the difference between 3 and 4 is what? I have a seat assigned in coach, or I don't have a seat assigned in coach. Does it make a difference? Should it make a difference for in the way the code will be written and in the way the test case will be written and the way I will test the system? Of course it does. Because in the first scenario here, when I had a coach seat assigned, I expect the system to release that coach seat that was assigned to me. In the second scenario, where I did not have a coach seat assigned, I don't expect to verify that the system releases a seat. Now, this is important for the developer. If the developer does not know this upfront, how is he or she going to write the code? Okay, then in the next scenario, we move to a different sort of negative scenario using invalid credit card. In the scenario after that, we move to some uncommon extreme situation, another shall not do situation here. You see that? I hope you're following me. Now let's move on. All these are still one passenger on the reservation, but what if I have multiple people on the reservation? That's totally different set of scenarios. Because when I'm traveling with my wife and my daughter, I now have other things to worry about, such that am I going to upgrade everyone to first class or not? And if I'm going to upgrade everyone, the precondition is that are there enough seats in first class for everyone? Or are there seats enough only for one or two of us and not the rest? Now, I don't want you to be surprised that about this last one here. Yes, when you have multiple people in the reservation, some people might have a coach seat assigned, some are not, for whatever reason. I know most airlines would do the same. If you have 3 people in the reservation, they will either assign a seat in coach or in the class that you paid for to everybody, or they want to postpone that for everybody until you get to the gate. But I am just want to make sure that if the system does something different when they assign seats to people, I want to make sure that I handle this in the scenarios. All right. Now, as you can tell, I can split my scenarios to positive scenarios, which are about the normal course of action. And negative scenarios, which can be using invalid data, abnormal and extreme conditions, and shall not do situations. These are important. And in the methodology, and I teach you this methodology in all details, believe it or not, in the course I teach for the International Institute for Software Testing. It's called Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design. and we break the attendees into teams. They work together, and they do all the tasks of the methodology. And let me tell you this. Here is the observation I always have from this class, and I got the data collected from all the classes I have been holding since the mid-90s, believe it or not. One large spreadsheet. I ask people after they use the methodology to build their scenarios and write their test cases. I say, now tell me, how many test cases, how many negative test cases did you write? And compare this to what you have normally would have written if you used just acceptance criteria or anything else, or just the requirement, or just the user story. The answer is amazing. It's more than 500-600%. Okay, people tell me that normally I would have written, say, five negative test cases. Now with the negative scenarios, I'm writing 50. Okay, that's very critical. Now, why am I so hung up on negative testing? Because it is the most critical thing in the quality of our applications. Okay, risk-based analysis or risk-based testing. Very important. Not all scenarios are equal. Not all scenarios are equally important. That's why in the methodology we give a risk factor to each scenario. Three risk factors: impact of failure, the frequency of the scenario happening, and the probability of failure. And most importantly, based on these three together, the methodology calculates testing priority. And that's simply assuming that high is 3, medium is 2, and low is 1. You add and divide by 3. Very simple way of calculating the testing priority. So here I have 3 plus 1 plus 1, that's 5, divided by 3, it's 1.33. So that's why the testing priority here is going to be always either 3.0, in which case all the three parameters are high, or 2.66 or 2.33 or 2.0, and so on down. And the lowest priority is 1.0. And that's when all of them are low, right? Like this one here. And then you can sort this by testing priority and get the ones that are higher priority to test at the top. Why did I come up with this? Because in my practice, I found that people come up with a very large number of scenarios. Easily, when you take a user story or a requirement, you can easily come up with 40, 50 scenarios. And if you plan to test all those, you may not have time to test all of them. That's a way to choose or to select which scenarios you'll be testing and which not. Okay, again, the methodology explained in more details in that course, but also in my other webinar, scenario-based development and testing. And here are some reasons why I'm suggesting that you use scenarios. I don't think I want to go through them because I already explained them. It allows you to do risk-based testing. It addresses all the limitations of the acceptance criteria. It works for both user stories and the requirements. It doesn't matter what you're using. And they're certainly much more precise because they address situations that cannot be addressed. Well, I shouldn't say cannot be addressed with acceptance criteria, because again, I should say it addresses situations that normally we do not address in acceptance criteria. Now, when people get confused about, okay, now what do we do because we've been using acceptance criteria, I say you can continue to use acceptance criteria as they are, or you can continue to use them and then add scenarios to them. And that's the practice I've seen every company I went to help them implement the methodology. They say, okay, I think we want to keep our acceptance criteria, but we need to add scenarios because scenarios will allow us to add much more details. And that's okay, except the problem here is that they give the developers the acceptance, or they let developers work from the acceptance criteria, which is not complete, and then they let testers work from scenarios. I don't like that. I don't like that. because now testers are going to be testing stuff that developers did not know about. It's not fair. It's not fair. If you are going to test in a certain way, your developers need to know, because so that they can write the code to comply. The third approach is just to do without acceptance criteria and do scenarios. I'm not going to decide for you what to do. You decide. Your team decides. Okay? Now, I need to spend the next 8 minutes. I have only 8 minutes left to show you how Romana ALM as an application lifecycle management supports those ideas of scenarios. Logged in before the session, so let me re-log in. This is Romana ALM. If you have not seen it before, it is available for you. Whether this is the dashboard, you can, once you open a project, you see the dashboard that gives you a lot of data about your project. But let's just move directly to user stories. And here are my user stories, the functional user stories, the quality user stories, all other user stories are down here. Okay. And if I were to select any one of these user stories, it doesn't matter. Here, I'll take this one here. Now we need to know that those user stories, these are actually projects of implementing Romana ALM. So the user stories in these projects are actual requirements, actual features in the Romana ALM. Okay, so here is a user story. And here's a description of the user story. I mean, we need to add description. There is nothing that says we cannot. And then here are acceptance criteria. You can add as many as you want. I just put here 2 of them. An acceptance criteria here has, either you tested it or not. And if you tested it, it's either pass or fail. If I say that I also tested this, then I have to specify did it pass or fail. Okay. Now, along with acceptance criteria, so this is a project that's using both acceptance criteria and scenario. And here are my scenarios. This user story has 24 scenarios. If I click here, it shows me all the 4 scenarios, all the 24 scenarios. And here are the risk factors. Here are the test priority. Here are other data that's relevant. So if I click on any one of them here, I can see the details of the scenario, nothing more except down here. I can ask people to review the scenario or add comments about the scenario, and that's very important because a developer might easily think that this scenario is not part of this user story. Fine, go ahead and write and put your comment here, put your thoughts here, and let everyone else read your thoughts. And let's the discussion go on to decide whether, in fact, this scenario is part of the user story or not. Down here, you can, I use a scenario heavily in the concept of exploratory testing. So we write a lot of exploratory testing based on scenarios. And that's, so here, if I do testing priority and I decide that I have about 40 scenarios or 30 scenarios, and I have time only to test only 15 of them, then what do? I choose the highest priority 15, and I test those, or I plan to test those the way I would test any important things. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to ignore the other 10 or 15. No, you can still test the other 10 or 15, but with less formal testing. And that's what I call exploratory / ad hoc testing. But it's not totally exploratory because I have scenarios. So I have written scenarios already. That's a very important, that's a big difference between the way I ask people to do exploratory testing and the way everyone else does. You've got to come up with scenarios. I think other people recommended something called the charter. I'm not, if the charter looks the same as scenario, I'm okay with that. Okay. Remember, in the scenario, I have my expected behavior right here. Okay. And I always suggest that even if it is optional field. It's not a required field. It doesn't have an asterisk like that. But I always suggest the following. Leave it blank only if you think the scenario or the expected behavior of the scenario is obvious and straightforward, right? This one here says try to configure the issue report attribute status value closed. Okay, if I don't expect anything abnormal to happen, then I don't need to put expected behavior. But in this case, I explicitly said what you shall not be able to do this, because that's one of the shall not do scenarios. I'm not going to explain to you why, because that has to do with the way Romana ALM handles acceptance, the issue report status. But again, it's one of the shall not do scenarios. That's why the expected behavior is that you shouldn't be able to. So that's why I'm putting it. If it was something else, if it was something common or expected, then I wouldn't put it here. All right. Now, we will also take those scenarios, the important scenarios, the high priority scenarios, and write what? Write actual test cases. And in my methodology, test cases are grouped into test sets. So I can now create a test set for this specific scenario, and the test set will consist of a number of test cases. In this example here, I don't have any test cases. I don't have any test sets. I can certainly click on this and create a test set. I can click on this and create test cases. I already created one test ad hoc test here, and obviously it passed. If I want to see the test case, I look here, and that's the exploratory / ad hoc test case. Very simple. It doesn't have much going on. It just has a title, the description, expected results, and the actual results. I don't want to drill down anymore in the chain or in the hierarchy, because as you can see at the top here, we have user stories, we have scenarios, we have ad hoc testing. I am now looking at the ad hoc test. If I want to go back to the scenario, I can click here. I can go back all the way to my user story and go here. Now here's the user story. Again, it has all this other important stuff, but today I just decided to look at those scenarios. With that, I am concluding my presentation. Let me see if anyone has a question. Question here from Ron. Who sets the criteria used for the risk-based testing? Good question. It's the product owner along with the testers, and even if the product owner is collaborating with the customers closely, then that would be the best situation. Testers could be involved or not. The only reason testers can be involved is because they are able to give some more insight about how much effort does it take to test those scenarios. They might say, well, if we're going to test this and this and that, we might as well test those too, because it would not take much time to do that. But certainly, in order to make things smooth and effective, I think the product owner can sit down very quick and assign those parameters. Thank you so much, Ron, for the question. That's an important question. Interestingly enough, that I teach people that how to do it, but no one ever asked me who's supposed to do it. All right. With that being said, I want to encourage you, please, to go to the Romana ALM website, free trials. Here's where you can see where to try it. You can do only the requirement / user stories package. You can do the testing. You can do the whole Romana ALM. We're launching a very exciting effort here, which is the ability to be able to use the Romana ALM from within Jira. We figured out Jira users want to do a lot of things, but Jira does not allow them to do this. So you'll be able to access most of this functionality from within Jira very soon, when you see the Romana ALM listed in the marketplace, in the Atlassian marketplace. Again, thank you so much for being with me. Hopefully we'll see you in future webinars. Thanks again.